Welcome to this brief webinar on changes to consumers' purchasing behaviour during COVID-19 in southwest WA. This webinar will talk through some consumer and stakeholder perspectives on the impact of the pandemic on our food supply. When COVID-19 started really appearing in Australia, we saw a vicious cycle of food supply issues and hoarding that was happening due to consumers being worried about the amount of food available for them. So it was a vicious cycle. We did see some signals of some social unrest, which came to speculative hoarding, where people were stockpiling certain food items and non-food items. That then triggered price increases for a variety of different products, which signalled food scarcity, and then so the cycle continues. This project was conducted in southwest Western Australia, and it was a three-phase project. Our first phase was where we initiated a consumer survey that was conducted online via Qualtrics, and that was from May to July in 2020. Our second phase, which happened somewhat concurrently, included telephone interviews with people working across the food supply chain. So producers, retailers, people working in local government, hospitality, and also institutions that feed people, so childcare centres and aged care centres and so on. And our third phase included starting to implement identified recommendations or looking for pathways in which we could do this. The first section I'll talk about now is consumer reflections on food supply issues, purchasing and consumption behaviours. Consumers mentioned in their survey the issue of the higher price of a variety of food options. Some comments that they made in the survey was that this led them to purchasing less healthy alternatives and also cheaper meals because they might have been impacted financially by COVID-19, be it through decreased employment or unemployment. And then people were also mentioning that the food costs was dependent on the type of food. So depending on which food group it was, if there were supply issues, that really depended on whether that particular product increased in price or stayed more or less the same. Consumers also mentioned in their open-ended comments that they purchased more food than usual because they were trying to shop less frequently. So in that, they were buying more or greater amounts when they were doing their shopping. There were numerous comments about panic buying. So they were talking about the fact that desired foods that they wanted were unavailable when they went shopping. So staples like pasta and flour, and also some frozen vegetables, meat and other items. Some consumers reported buying small amounts of short supply foods, whereas others stocked up where they could so that they could ensure that their household had these types of foods. And there was a focus by a number of consumers on fresh or seasonal produce, so it really made them think about buying those types of foods more during the pandemic, and they reported consuming pre-prepared or takeaway food less. A number of people also talked about using staple or longer lasting foods so that they knew that they would at least have this in their household when they needed it. So this consumer said, occasionally I would buy 2 instead of 1 as you never knew when it was going to be available again. Consumers were also asked to report on aspects of their food purchasing behaviours, and one of those was where they shopped. So a number of consumers talked about having to go to numerous places to buy their food, where they might have gone to 1 or 2 food outlets. Normally, they needed to go sometimes up to 8 or 9 different places to get the same foods that they normally did. And that was more or less because of the panic buying really made the availability of food a lot less, the types of foods that they wanted, so they had to go further afield to get that same food. There were also alternative food networks and outlets that really flourished. So different online ordering systems, food boxes, ordering directly from producers, and also looking at smaller outlets, so your corner stores or independent supermarkets, because people felt safer purchasing their food from there rather than going to large supermarkets where lots of people were. Takeaway and home deliveries were very prolific during the lockdown period or the height of the pandemic in Western Australia initially, because people talked about click and collect options. They were able to go and pick up and take away the food, not have to stay around for too long in a location, and also the fact that they were really utilising home delivery where possible. And those types of options were more available. With respect to the frequency of shopping, consumers talked about decreasing the frequency of their food purchasing. So from every other day to once a week or once every 10 days. And then during those times, they did stock up. So frequency and amount of food were interrelated. People talked about the fact that while they tried to shop less, they wanted to make sure they had enough food in their household. So this consumer said, I used to go to the grocery store twice a week and mostly buy small quantities of food. However, with 2 at-risk people at home, we had to limit our outings and therefore shop larger quantities at once. Now we'll move to the section on food supply stakeholder comments. So these are the people working across the food supply chain, and these are their perspectives of what happened during the pandemic. Practicality was a theme that was determined through our thematic analysis of the interviews with these food supply stakeholders. So they talked about consumers prioritising really quick shopping trips. So they wanted to get in, get out. They didn't want to stay around and increase their risk of contracting the virus. There was a perception that drive-through options and home deliveries and online orders were very, very popular, and particularly those producer or retailer stakeholders who had businesses where these sorts of things were impacted positively commented at how much they had grown their business in these types of modes or methods of getting food to people. So corner stores were also perceived as a lot more popular, which really emulated those consumer comments. So people were feeling a lot safer going to these smaller stores. Similarly to the consumers, the food supply stakeholders talked about panic buying. So some behaviours were that people were stockpiling food. There was questioning around whether people would actually use the food that they were buying bulk buying, so the longer shelf life or shelf-stable items so that they could ensure that they had them in their pantries, and then emptying food outlet shelves. So they were witnessing lots of this types of behaviour, making sure that they had enough food for their household, but not considering how much they actually need. So this producer was talking about a cycle where they'd have a lot of sales, so people within the food supply couldn't keep up with the demand, but then once people's fridges were full, they would buy nothing for another 10 days, so that they would go back to the panic buying routine. So it was very hard for it from a supply chain perspective to keep up with this cycle. Food supply stakeholders also talked about an increased demand for locally grown produce. So particularly retailer stakeholders were talking about their conversations with consumers. So they were saying people were resisting buying imported food. They were worried about safety concerns. So they wanted to really look at the trusted types of foods, so Australian or Western Australian or even regional. They were talking about a priority to buy local and support small farmers. So there was a sense that people really wanted to support their local communities and their local farmers during this time. And then consumers were perceived to also redirect some funds that they would normally spend from their household budget on social outings or travel, but buying nicer quality food for their family. And this retailer said, it's changed the way people even deal with us in respect to them being far more appreciative of what the farmers do and what we were doing during this period. So there's definitely been a shift in attitude for people. There was also this notion of food-independent consumers. So those consumers who didn't rely on the large supermarket chains for their food, they wanted to do things a bit differently. So they sourced food direct from producers. They cooked more food from scratch. They stored food and preserved it. And then they were bringing their food from home to work for lunch. They weren't relying on outlets to be purchasing their food from regularly. They also grew their food a lot. So these might have been people that had farms, or families had farms, or they had gardens within their own homes that were able to produce a reasonable amount of food for their consumption. Also, the types of foods purchased were discussed by stakeholders. So they said that higher quality fruits and vegetables were purchased, healthier and hearty foods, because of this perception that consumers wanted to preserve their immunity or bolster their immunity and increase their health during this time where it was a health crisis. And they also talked about consumers being more tolerant of imperfect and less familiar produce. So people were looking to experiment with new types of fruits and vegetables, for example, that they weren't usually using. So this comment was just talking about they were buying hearty foods and they were being a bit more imaginative. So they were substituting different foods for the ones that weren't available. Some recommendations that we have drawn together from our work in this area is that we really do need to boost collaboration and relationships between food supply stakeholders and consumers. So retailers working together to cross-promote businesses, offer food relief and goodwill for vulnerable people, and really try to establish those communication networks between food supply stakeholders, because this would increase knowledge around price increases, the fluctuation, availability and access of food, and then distributing food differently. So there was some suggestions having locally grown produce more visible in supermarkets, given the increased interest in it, and also the challenges with navigating really central distribution points within the Perth metropolitan area, rather having something within the region itself to better offer local food distribution. Also considering cafes selling staple foods such as they did during the pandemic, and then supplying recipes with produce to encourage consumers to be able to do more with that particular produce. And then another recommendation is identifying and educating vulnerable populations about how they can gain access to food. So trying to develop new and creative ways to inform the community around accessing food for everyone. So I hope you've enjoyed this brief webinar on some of our preliminary findings from our work investigating the impact of COVID-19 on food supply in regional southwest Western Australia.